All right, great. So for about the last week, I've been attempting to conclude Ulysses and to start Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, called Der Zauberberg in German. Just something interesting about that. Obviously, Zauber means magic, and Berg means mountain. There are countless references to this in contemporary culture, but something I noticed recently, I've been reading through some children's literature for a small project I've been doing, and the writer Diane Wynne Jones, I believe, of Howl's Moving Castle, which was made into a movie by Studio Ghibli and a very famous Hayao Miyazaki. Well, that is part of a trilogy, and in the third book of that children's book series, The House of Many Ways, the young magician finds a book, and it is called Der Zauberberg, which is obviously an allusion to Der Zauberberg, as well as just a very intelligent representation of what a book of magic would be in German. Der Zauberbuch, the book of magic, the magic. In any case, we're going to have to really consider what makes this mountain magic and magical, because we have run into magic several times during the course of this semester. In particular, Don Quixote and enchantments, and the relationship between enchantment, magic, delusional thinking, lying to each other was very, very strong. We see also magic in Goethe's Faust, though the magic seems a little bit more real. It's sort of unholy magic that Mephistopheles uses in order to bring about the malign desires of Goethe's Faust. But the magic, for all of its negative effects, for all its desire to wish ill, ends up doing good. Remember that is one of the claims that Mephistopheles makes about himself in the very, very beginning, I believe in the prologue, that he is the spirit that wishes to do well or wishes to do ill, but ends up doing good, as it were. So when we see The Magic Mountain here by Thomas Mann, we are led to wonder as modernists what the magic really is. Truly substantial, transformative, sort of holy magic, or is it again some sort of delusional, illusory, prestidigitation, sleight of hand sort of magic? In fact, I think it was David Copperfield. I saw something like 20 years ago. He was getting very, very famous for doing huge illusions. And one of the illusions he did, and I was watching this on TV, so they could do whatever they wanted with the illusions, ostensibly. But he had an audience in front of him, and he moved a mountain. He literally moved a mountain. There was a mountain that was in one location and moved to another. There are all sorts of staging effects that could lead to that. But the idea of moving mountains is a very powerful one when it comes to thinking about magic. That is sort of the archetypal thing. If magic could work, the ultimate thing it could do is to move physical space from one place to another. Maybe, maybe not. In any case, talk a little bit about Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann and Katja Mann, and I say Mann because it's German, so not man, but Mann. Thomas Mann and also Thomas Mann, not Thomas Mann, and Katja Mann in front of the house entrance in the Pacific Palisades. This is from the library in Zurich, but Pacific Palisades when they had moved to California, fleeing from the Nazis in Germany. Obviously, Thomas Mann lived in Germany during World War I, then fled, I think just prior to World War II. I have that on the slides. And himself, like many modernist authors, lived in sort of exile, just like James Joyce lived in Paris for about 20 years. Figures like Joseph Conrad, Gertrude Stein lived outside of Ernest Hemingway, and of course, very famously, T.S. Eliot, who left America for England, left outside of their countries of origin. So did Thomas Mann, with the added sort of cosmopolitan element, like James Joyce, like Joseph Conrad, that he lived among the people that spoke a language not his native one. He was a native German speaker. Obviously, he had excellent English because he lived here in America, but he lived among people that did not speak his native language. And that is part of what the modernists were. They were people that went out into the diaspora of the world, as it were, and tried to generate world culture to some extent, or did generate world culture, even regardless of their particular desires. Let's talk a little bit about it. Thomas Mann, 1875 to 1955. So he bridges the 19th century, 20th century. Yeah, he achieved fame, very, very first novel. So this is just similar to Goethe. This is a figure who did not have to struggle for literary fame. Unlike who do I want to say unlike? Dostoevsky was sort of famous early on. Joyce had to fight quite a bit and had other people fight for him, like Ezra Pound, asserting that he had great potential, because obviously there were many great writers that really didn't like Joyce. But Cervantes, I think Cervantes is a nice contrast. Cervantes really wanted to be famous, but he never quite made it during the course of his life. He's far more famous now after his death than he was during the course of his life. Not the case with Thomas Mann. His very first book, and he already achieves literary prestige, very like his countryman Goethe. Though, of course, Goethe was born into the Holy Roman Empire, living in Germany later in his life. So his first book, 1901, you know, he's only 26 years old, still living in you, which recounts the story of the physical decline of once vigorous merchant family as it turns from business to the arts. His other major works include Death in Venice, very short work, very interesting work. For those of you who are very much afflicted by COVID, it is a plague story, a story of a plague coming to Venice, and a story of an artist's sort of useful pedophilic homoeroticism overcoming his desire for safety. Very strange short story, full of pathos, full of well, hard to say, full of the sort of sordid details you might now be expecting to find in modernist novels, insofar as you think of them in terms of Ulysses, perhaps Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, obviously very sordid, and then the sort of desire that is laid out in Death in Venice. But again, it's like a 90-page little novella, highly worth reading, one of the great short stories in existence. The Magic Mountain came out in 1924. Tetralogy, that means that's one plus a trilogy, four work series, and of course Dr. Faustus. So he too has written a Faust. His own son, which will be interesting that I mentioned that he has a son in a moment, given that some additional details I'll give you about Thomas Mann's life that are common knowledge. His son even wrote a work that features Faustus that is widely considered a roman à clef. It's an excellent little French phrase for you. It means a story with a key, as in it is a symbolic story. It's the story that is told in the narrative is itself representing another story. Thomas Mann's son, I believe his name is Christopher Mann, and I have seen this movie, also wrote a work featuring Faustus, but in fact it was called Mephisto. A lot of people, Mephistopheles is a bit of a hard name to say, especially if you've only ever read it. Where do you put the intonation? Mephistopheles. So a lot of people just call him Mephisto. This is in fact the actual title of the both novel and movie that is based on it that Christopher Mann wrote. So Faust, you see that Faust has had a huge influence on Germany by the time we get to Thomas Mann and to his son in the time between World War I and World War II here in 1925. Remember World War I, 1914, 1918, World War II, 1931 to 35-ish. Right, I think so. And sometimes I think about when America enters the war, and that gets my numbers off. But 1925 is right in this intermezzo liminal period between one world war and a second world war, a time when people are questioning everything, various political systems, economic systems. Should we have monarchies? Should we have democracies? Should we believe in socialism? Should we believe in capitalism? What is the place of religion in life? Is the West the best? What about this America place that seems to now be a great power rather than just these European powers? And where is Russia in all of this? And what about this newly emerging world part of the world called the East, with places like China and Japan, which both have achieved great power status during the course of the 20th and 21st century. First, Japan, obviously, they're part of World War II, Axis powers, and were very powerful, very brutal against China. And now, obviously, in the 21st century, China is the number 2 economic power in the world. So the world was really, really starting to change. Remember the communication devices, the telegraph, the telephone, the plane is being developed. At this time, the world is expanding. It is in some ways the opposite of what Jack Sparrow said in Pirates of the Caribbean when he says, the world is getting smaller. The world is getting very much bigger at this time, but is leading to bigger and bigger questions as well with these figures. Bigger and bigger questions that they need to contend with. So Thomas Mann was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929. I think he's our only Nobel laureate in this class. He left Germany in 1933 after the Nazi seizure, or excuse me, I meant to say 1941 to 1945. If I said 1931 to 35 for World War II, that was wrong. It is 1941 to 45. Good, I'm glad I corrected. In any case, he left Germany in 1933 after the Nazi seizure of power, lived in Switzerland, and then moved to the United States, California in 1939. Mann was a member of the League of Nations Committee. Remember that prior to the United Nations, there was a much vitiated form of international organization called the League of Nations in the early 20th century. The League of Nations Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, established in 1922 for the purpose of building up international relations among teachers, artists, scientists, and members of other intellectual professions, and improving the working conditions of the educated workforce. Its members included scientists like Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, and Bela Bartok. Interestingly, around this time, Albert Einstein, Jewish scientist with Jewish psychoanalyst, founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, wrote a series of open letters. Open letters are letters that you write to somebody that you expect to be read by the public, where they talked about the problems of war, how intellectuals don't believe in war, and yet still war happens. So this is a time in which intellectuals, particularly ones from the German-speaking world, Einstein, German-speaking world, Freud, also German-speaking world, Austria is a German-speaking place, and Thomas Mann. These are intellectuals who are taking seriously the role of being intellectuals during times of political ferment. Not only political ferment, but political ferment caused by changing economic conditions, international conditions, and technological conditions too. Remember, the communication has become much faster. Also, travel is becoming much faster very rapidly. It was in the 1910s that the Titanic sank. By World War II, there were, even during World War I, there were plane battles between people. There were planes in existence. And so we often talk about now this contemporary postmodern day as rapidly changing. The speed at which the world started changing was really ramping up at this time. So in any case, in 1926, just a year after the Magic Mountain was published, the committee moved from Geneva to Paris, where it was reestablished as the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation. Right. So let's talk about the Magic Mountain itself. First published in 1924, and it takes place over the course of 7 years. Note this, it's so interesting, this novel form. Thomas Mann, the Magic Mountain is often considered a long read. Depending on which famous English translation we have, the Low Quarter or the one from which we're reading, The Woods, it can range from something like 1,200 pages down to 750 pages, depending on how the translator translates. That said, Ulysses is a pretty long text too, around 750, 800 pages. Very similar amount of pages, ostensibly a similar amount of words too. And yet, Ulysses only covers the span of 1 day, whereas the Magic Mountain, 7 years. Perhaps it's something that you have thought about at times when you say go to a movie and maybe you watch the movie Phone Booth and it takes place in one location in a phone booth during the course of several hours. And then, really what happened during the course of that text? Whereas or that movie. Whereas sometimes you might watch a movie, some Marvel movie like Guardians of the Galaxy or something, and you go all over the cosmos, far beyond even where humans have ever gone before. And perhaps you can go back in time, forward in time, depending on which Marvel movie it is, and lots of time and ground are covered. I encourage you to think about time in particular and how time is spent during the course of this text. In fact, at the very end of this lecture, or these lecture slides, which we we will not get to those by the end of today, I really talk a little bit about time, and Thomas Mann himself encourages us to think about time by frequently speaking about it, but also having a very famous excursus on time in the Magic Mountain. Okay, so it takes place over 7 years. Which 7 years? Well, James Joyce's Ulysses took place, we know, 1904, though it was published in 1922. This work takes place from 1907 to 1914, even though it was published in 1924, 1925. What do we know begins in 1914? We know that World War I, the Great War, begins then. So what bookends this text? Is the fact that the Great War begins. And in fact, our protagonist will enter into the fray, as it were. I think you'll find a very interesting moment because this is a protagonist who is not known for doing very much at all. I encourage you to see this. I was having a conversation with one of our students just the other day, and it really made me think a little bit differently about this protagonist. But you may want to parallel juxtapose this protagonist, who's Hans Castorp, who seems to drop out of the world for 7 years, and we'll talk about that, not to get a doctorate, but to stay at a tuberculosis sanatorium when perhaps he has tuberculosis, probably not. He has a spot, just a spot. You might want to contrast and juxtapose him to the underground man, another individual who sort of drops away from society. But something you should note about Hans Castorp, different from the underground man, and certainly different from, say, a Stephen Daedalus, and certainly different from even a Don Quixote, is that he is known to be a very ordinary man. He's not too tall, too strong, too smart, too clever. In fact, there will be a series of extraordinarily intelligent individuals in the Magic Mountain, including the Renaissance man, Ludovico Settembrini, as well as one converted Jesuit named Nafta. And these will be the intellectual powerhouses in the Magic Mountain. And so Hans Castorp is just sort of like a regular, everyday man. He is much more what I think superficial critics of Ulysses call Leopold Bloom. So Leopold Bloom, you can tell people don't read Ulysses very closely, even when they do happen to read it. A lot of people call him an everyman. I think no, this is incorrect. Leopold Bloom is much smarter than the everyday person, also much more empathetic, sympathetic, and much more effective, and is going through quite a bit during the course of his day. You might say that he shares something with every person, and that he, like any human who starts to age, has to deal with the increasing problems that one becomes aware of in one's life, and also the decreasing amount of people that one, or the increasing amount of people who have left the world that have been important to one. Obviously, people continue to be born, and that's a great thing, and one gets to see new members of one's family and one's friends come about, but one also sees one's friends and one's older family members disappear. This is something that Leopold Bloom, like any of us, shares with all humanity. That said, he is not an everyday person in that he is common. Hans Castorp very much is. And I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I will enjoy describing him to you. So 1907 to 1914, begin at World War I on a battlefield in Flanders, Belgium. Recall that 1914, 1918, the Flanders Fields was a major battle theater on the Western Front during the First World War. 1 million soldiers from more than 50 countries were wounded, missing, or killed in action here. This is a tremendous number of people for battle. Something I think we don't do a very good job of teaching the costs of war during the course of your history education, but something you should know is that back all the way in the ancient Greek and ancient times, when there were battles between people, there would sometimes be 0 deaths. The expectation when you went to battle was not that you were necessarily going to die. People would die. Really, it was the Romans and their legions that started bringing about the convention of being so brutal that they would kill you if you fought against them. And that was part of the Roman tactic. That's something that, say, for example, our Navy SEALs still do. If you attack a Navy SEAL unit, they respond with unstoppable force. Huge machine guns. They turn into a giant bullet-shooting hedgehog. And that is basically what the Roman strategy was. So Rome was very effective in war because it was so costly to fight against them, and they were so willing to die and kill you that it changed how war was fought. Keep in mind too that technology has changed for World War I. Now we have trench warfare. This is what leads to this terrible condition that we colloquially call shell shock, where these men in these trenches would be constantly afflicted by, oh, you live in Baton Rouge, you've heard the train at night, but something much worse than that, these shells that would explode, shoot shrapnel, and shake the ground, and they were loud, they were percussion. That was part of the torture of them. They're so loud, you never know when they're going to come. And so for the rest of your life, when you hear something loud, you don't know what you feel what you felt before. And it takes you back to that moment. Keep in mind also there's mustard gas that is this terrible chemical agent, leads to a host of terrible physical issues. I don't even know all of them that can be shot down into the trenches. So, and not to mention there are now planes with bombs and machine guns. And so the instruments of war have become far more devastating by the time of World War I. And we have not even gone to World War II, where the ultimate weapon, as far as we're concerned, is developed. Atom bomb, which has been to some extent perfected now, because now we have a form of atom bomb that is something like, that uses an atom bomb as a trigger and has the force of something like 50 bombs. I'm forgetting the name of it right now. It's not called a neutron bomb. It has a great name, though. But in any case, as our technology has developed and our communication has developed, our knowledge of the world has developed, and a sort of world culture starts to, or at least intellectuals start to consider bringing about one. Keep in mind that all of these developments are also lending their hand to the development of the devices of war, so that we now see unprecedented amounts of people die in things like a million soldiers is, to say that is a ton of soldiers is really to miss the fact that that is actually what several thousand tons of soldiers that died. That is too much light coaches, too much understanding. And so, in any case, they were wounded, missing, or killed in action there. Entire cities and villages were destroyed. If you ever traveled through Europe, particularly places like Germany, if you go to, say, Munich or Mainz, you will find buildings there in the middle of old towns that have been reconstructed, have been clearly reconstructed. You go to places like Munich, where they had the Nazi rallies, and where Hitler spent his young artistic days. You can find bullet holes still in many of the buildings as well. An interesting piece of cultural memory that I was told by a tour guide in Mainz, and spent some time there under the supervision of Harvard at the Institute of World Literature, was that, interestingly, the Germans remember the Brits as having bombed them and maintain sort of a resentment against the Brits, whereas in reality, you know who bombed Mainz? It was the Americans. It was the Americans. Though sort of an interesting thing is that, and this is generally sort of true. So let me put it like that. Two caveats there, that Germany and Japan and contemporary Germans and Japanese people tend to have high opinions of Americans. Maybe the last few weeks accepted. Lots of countries are not super excited about this and that. But we helped both Germany and Japan after defeating them in World War II, really destroying them. Keep in mind, we dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, but we helped to restore their economies and to build both of the countries back up to the point where now Germany is again the #1 country in Europe, and Japan is not the #1 country in Asia. It's China, but it at least until the 1990s was having sort of an economic renaissance. But you should keep that in mind when you think about what changes and doesn't change in this world. Our great enemies from World War II did great evils. The Nazis, 6 million Jews killed. The Japanese did similarly horrifying things. If you look up Unit 735, the numbers might not be exactly correct. They did human experimentation on people in Manchuria, Chinese people. They dehumanized them, thought they were not human, and would torture, vivisect, and do all sorts of terrible experiments on these individuals. And so these were our enemies. And now they are both allies of ours. And because we helped to restructure their economies, bring them back up from the terrors or the terrible outcomes of war, and then to rebuild them into what they have become today. Okay, in any case, this work, The Magic Mountain, was originally conceived as a comic companion to A Death in Venice, which ends in a bit of a tragic and really sort of gross way. It is an older man giving into his lust and then dying of plague because he cannot get over his attractiveness to a young boy, really, who is traveling in Venice with his family. He becomes really, really obsessed with this kid. It's a lot like Lolita. If you ever read Lolita, you may know, is like one of the most risque stories ever written. It's about a man who develops a pedophilic obsession with the daughter of the woman that he marries but doesn't really like very much, and then consummates it, and then lives with it. And so it is really pushing the boundaries, Lolita. And so worth knowing about that, because Thomas Mann includes such details himself. And so you can really see people pushing the boundaries of what can be represented here in these texts. Might not seem like, I don't know, even today I would say that those sorts of themes there would be heavy criticism if any author were to try it, even if an author were to write a masterpiece trying it. In any case, 1914, Thomas Mann wrote through, I'm not sure exactly what this, between 1914 and 1915, that's why we have to edit well, Mann wrote through chapter 4 and the HIPAA subchapter. I'll have a bit to say about ship's law, HIPAA soon, and was still close to 820 pages to go. He laid aside the text for 4 years as he worked on reflections on an unpolitical man. He turns his mind to political thoughts. In any case, once he comes back in 1919 to the text, he finishes it by 1924. It was then in sale or on sale 8 weeks later, which means it went through editing pretty fast. His editors were pretty sure this is going to sell. It's already famous. This helps, right? J.K. Rowling comes out with a ninth Harry Potter. It's going to be on the shelves really, really fast, right? I come out with something that I call, like, I don't know, Arius Petrus or something. It'll never be on the shelf. It will take many, many years. So, well, become famous if you want things to happen fast. The text has been argued to be political or unpolitical by many commentators. It shows a vision of Weimar Germany. Weimar Germany is this strange Germany from 1918 to 1933. End of World War I, taking of power of the National Socialists. Remember, National Socialists are the full title of the Nazis, people that are abbreviated as Nazis. Okay, so Mann was always, this is very important. Important enough for me to take a pause and sip on my espresso. Mann was always a fervent opponent of National Socialism. He finds himself on the right side of history. A figure I've mentioned several times, particularly in connection with James Joyce, is Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound is an American who was known to be a almost great writer, but much more of a great facilitator of great writers. Worked quite a bit to help T.S. Eliot get his works published, as well as Ulysses, which is one of the greatest things that Ezra Pound did. He himself wrote a very famous work based on Dante's Divine Comedy called the Cantos, which includes many different languages in it, as well as many small chapters called Cantos. Differently from Dante, he doesn't just have Italian and Latin in this text. He also has Chinese characters in it as well. It in this modernist fashion is full of many languages. It is difficult to read unless one is truly, truly cosmopolitan. It is something like an encyclopedia that requires encyclopedic knowledge in order really to understand it. All that said, he lent himself to Italian fascism and became very influenced by Il Duce Benito Mussolini, the head of the fascist movement and fascist party and head of Italy during World War II. And in fact, I believe he was charged with treason and either was exiled from or lost his citizen status in the US, or had something like Edward Snowden against him, where if he were ever to be returned to the US, he would be prosecuted for his political beliefs. Ezra Pound, other side of history from Thomas Mann. Unlike writers like Heidegger, Martin Heidegger is one of the greatest 20th century German philosophers. He was a phenomenologist, wrote a very powerful work that people who read philosophy like to claim that they've read, like people who read literature like to claim they've read Ulysses, called Sein und Zeit, which is being and time, and is his most influential work. That said, he lent his intellectual capacity to the Nazis after they took power, and this has marred his intellectual legacy to some extent. Because of Thomas Mann's firm resistance in speech and writing, Thomas Mann's studies took time to get off the ground in Germany. You should think about that. One of the things that was commonly said by Germans after the Nazis lost power was that what could they do? And they didn't know everything that was going on at the time. And you know, there was a lot of guilt and not a lot of blame taking by the everyday person in Germany. And so why would it be the case that Thomas Mann studies would take time to get off the ground? Well, because he is one of the few Germans who had insight into the situation. And insofar as he had insight early and expressed himself clearly and publicly, he makes the people around him look really, really, really suspect and bad, right? They claim they couldn't have seen something. He's giving public lectures saying that he sees a problem. The fact that he was so perspicacious reflects very poorly on his countrymen. And so this has made him, unlike a Goethe, who is a tremendous national figure, a more of an ambiguous national figure, because he not only adds to the glory of the German literary name by being such an excellent author, but he also highlights some of the darkness in the German past as well. So he is an ambiguous figure, unlike Goethe, to his own people. And this is marked by the fact that he had to live outside of the home of his own people for so long, given their political sway. So the story itself, brief synopsis of the Magic Mountain. The story is the story of an ordinary or mediocre young man. In fact, there's some debate about the word that's used to translate ordinary or mediocre. There is a slight difference in those terms, right? You call someone ordinary, it's certainly not a compliment, but you're not really disparaging. But if you call them common, it's a little bit, let's do a little hierarchy here. It's like from good to bad. Ordinary is maybe in the middle, common, a little bit low, mediocre. It's basically the same thing as common, right? Mediocre. It means the same thing as ordinary. Yeah, mediocre. Mediocre, there's the idea that somebody doesn't quite measure up, right? Whereas common or ordinary, they're just at the measure, as it were. They're right in the middle of the curve. That's the kind of guy that Hans Castorp is. So in some ways, he's just the ordinary German. He studied to be an engineer. He is young, like Stephen Daedalus, 21, 22. Well, let me see what I have here. The story is the story of an ordinary or mediocre young man named Hans Castorp. We might focus on whether he is in fact ordinary or mediocre. That's right on. Who first visits his cousin Joachim Simpson for 3 weeks in a tuberculosis sanatorium, but then ends up staying for 7 years. Interesting bit of time there. While at the sanatorium, the soon-to-be engineer, he has studied engineering in the lowlands, and in fact, is taking this chance as not only an opportunity to see his ill cousin, who is significantly ill, very sadly, but also to have sort of 3 weeks of break between his education and starting his job. This is like many of you seniors who will hopefully do some sort of special thing this summer after you graduate. I guess the famous thing that some people do is they travel Europe, but hopefully you do something fun. Don't go to a tuberculosis sanatorium unless you have a cousin there and want to, or okay, spending some time. In any case, while he is at the sanatorium, he takes up the study of biology, very interested in biology, music, and even the occult. He, near the end of the text, he will in fact be at a seance where a spirit is summoned. A spirit of somebody very dear and close to him who had somewhat recently died. So this text really spans the gamut from sort of intellectual materialism, biology, right? If one is a biologist, one is not confronting things like the soul, for example. One deals with the concept of life, but where does one locate, in which organ does one find the principle of life, the soul? Is it in the brain? Is it in the heart? You know, the Greeks thought it was in the heart. They actually made up, I told you about the phrin, from which we get frenetic, frantic, that they thought that we had an organ right near the heart that caused frenzy. Yeah, right. And from which you could use, develop phronesis. which was called practical wisdom, or is defined as, translated as practical wisdom. In any case, like he himself is representing the ways people at this time go from a strict materialism, like a Bloom, thinking about hearts as pumps, not very poetically, but then with the absence of religion, this sort of spiritual a longing that humans have. Well, what is the vessel into which it is placed? Well, Hans Castorp shows that it is sort of a superficial vessel, that rather than having things like religious liturgies, like what Bloom gets to listen to and enjoy in this magical Latin, one might have, mediums and seances. And if one goes to Jackson Square and New Orleans, see all sorts of tarot card readers. And then one might ask, are these appropriate substitutes for what they are replacing? Are these equivalent to the task of what a religion seeks to do? Is reading tarot cards with a medium equivalent to sitting through a religious liturgy? Does it do the same thing for you? Perhaps so. In any case, this text is highlighting the problem. He develops a love interest in a woman named Claudia Shosha. Shosha is very interesting last name. It show in do we have any French figures here? I know we had at one point. Show means hot. Sha means cat. So her name is Hot Cat. Interestingly enough, in World War I, the Americans developed a machine gun called a Shosha, which was known to be, it was favored, but it was like sort of so poorly made that once it started to break down, and it would break down quickly, it was discarded, and they wouldn't even try to fix it. You should keep that notion of what that sort of machine gun was in mind when you observe the relationship that buds between Claudia Shosha and Hans Castorp. Is she herself riddled with tuberculosis, sort of a thing that is pleasant, but is riddled with mechanical problems that is going to be at some point cast off by the protagonist after a pleasant time together? Something you might also wonder in this sort of purgatorial or liminal space of the tuberculosis sanatorium. Keep in mind, the tuberculosis sanatorium is in a very cold, is in Switzerland, on top of a very cold mountain, and it's cold all year long, even during the summer, and it's often very snowy. So it is a place in which it feels like time does not pass. It isn't a place totally isolated. Is this a place in which a person can truly grow or develop a relationship? Is this a place where this very German concept, Bildungsroman, character development can even occur? Is this a text of character development, or is it a text of character decline? Hans Castorp stays in hospital for 7 years. How much could he possibly accomplish? And if he is a stand-in for a German person or a European person at this time, and while he has been goofing off for 7 years, 1907 to 1914, has that led to nothing happening? Or has perhaps his ignorance and his lack of seriousness been part of the giant tidal wave, or one molecule of water that causes the giant tidal wave that engulfs Europe and indeed the entire world? Is it his own moral lassitude that represents the moral lassitude of the German people and the Europeans at this time that allows this great evil, which is the Great War, to come about? This is part of, is this an unpolitical text where this character just leaves the world? It's not a commentary on the world itself, or is this very political? This is the perspective that people at the time of Thomas Mann took to their own detriment. Okay, so he meets an Italian rationalist progressive, as I mentioned earlier, Ludovico Settembrini, who calls him life's problem child, perhaps lending evidence to one of the perspectives just shared, the former one, not the latter one. He tries to convince Hans to rejoin the world, not to give into the dissipation and low eroticism of the mountain. Something about the people in this tuberculosis sanatorium. Some people get better, many people do not. They sit at 7 tables with something like 7 people at each of them. It's hard to meet individuals, but since they're sort of just spending time here, killing time here, people get into funny little, so they're not building their careers. They are to some extent trying to get better, but since they're kind of stuck in one place, they get up to hijinks. And so one of the hijinks is that there's a group of individuals called the One Lung Club who have had one of their lungs decompressed in order to allow it to heal while the other one takes on the strength. So these are part of the horrifying sort of biology in this very pleasant text. But because of that, some of them can whistle through their pneumothorax. So Hans Castorp sees an individual, she whistles out of her chest at him, and he thinks, it's quite weird, Hermione Clayfield. And he's told, oh, that's actually quite regular by Joachim Siemsen. But many of the figures also develop little liaisons, even ones who are married with individuals. Claudia Schoscha herself is married, though her husband does not stay at the sanatorium. And she says that her illness gives her freedom, that because of her illness, she can stay at the Berghof in Switzerland, she can go to Spain, she can go to wherever she needs to go without her husband in order to cure herself. It's unclear how sick she is. She is sick, but she's not so sick that she is suffering from mortal peril, as it were. In any case, life's problem child. Suddenbrini also tries to convince Hans Castorp when he first meets him the day that he arrives. And the next day he says, what if you were to pack up your things and leave immediately? Hans Castorp thinks that would be a bit rude. I'm up here for 3 weeks with my cousin. But Suddenbrini seems to already have an intuition into Hans's Castorp. He is the sort of person who will be attracted to Berghof. If you think of the Berghof as somewhere like, say, where the sirens are, or where the lotus eaters are from the Odyssey, it is a place that entices one in with easy living and a lack of consequences. Also, it's very well structured. Something you should keep in mind. There's breakfast, there's lunch, there's dinner, there's rest cure. There on every other Sunday, there's a band that plays. It's easy to live in this place because unlike in normal life, you do not yourself have to, or one does not have to create the narrative and structure one's existence oneself. But one just receives it. It's very like college, right? Like you have your dorm, and then you have your classes scheduled at particular times, and then there's the on-campus job that's at one time, and then there's this event at 8 p.m., and that happens all over again the very next day. Once you're out of the college environment, and you work a lot, but you basically have to structure your existence and make all of the events that are going to happen for yourself. The Berghof takes care of all of that. So it's an easy place to just sit back and relax, as it should be. But because of that, it is an attractive place to a young, ordinary man like Hans Castorp, who perhaps doesn't have any ambitions but to enjoy himself. So there are 2 physicians on this mountain. One is named Director Behrens, who himself supposedly had a small case of tuberculosis. He has very unique, so we get physical characteristics of some of the characters in this text, and he is described as rather large, protruding eyes, with his spine bones protruding out, because he's so tall that he has to bend over towards people, and his cheeks are always red. Supposedly he had lost his wife on this mountain at some point, and he just stayed up there. So he is sometimes called Rhadamanthus, alongside the psychoanalyst, Dr. Krakowski, who is described as Minos by Suddenbrini. These are very clever titles that Suddenbrini calls them by. Rhadamanthus and Minos are both brothers. Minos, King Minos of the Minotaur, who are guardians of the dead in Dante's Divine Comedy. It is in fact King Minos who in the Inferno twists his tail several times, however many times, to indicate which circle of hell you move to. So 9 times, 9th circle. Rhadamanthus is also mentioned in Virgil's Aeneid as, I believe, the judge of the Elysian fields, the good place, the heaven sort of place. Whereas Minos sends people down to Tartarus, the darker sort of place. And so Suddenbrini's own view of this tuberculosis sanatorium is that it is something like an underworld. Since there's Rhadamanthus and Minos, is it hell? Is it heaven? Perhaps unclear. But it is a place outside the normal boundaries of time and space, and therefore action as well. Something you should know about the underworlds, and whether it be Dante or Virgil or the Odyssey, is that shades, once they're dead, can do no thing. And so if one exists in sort of a nebulous underworld, What is one capable of achieving? What is one capable of becoming once one is in a space that is no space? An autopia. Sometimes people say a utopia. Topos, space, no. So we sometimes say utopia. But utopia may also come from utopia, good place. Euthanasia, good death, or euphemism, good word. In any case, yes, two of Mann's major influences were Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, just analytical psychologists who had major influence of it, and at least the first 20 years of the 20th century. And eventually, he also, this character Hans Castorp meets the Jewish, but now converted to Catholicism and Jesuit Leo Nafta, and the inarticulate but grand Mynheer Peeperkorn, who very rarely says anything that makes sense, and yet has a regal presence. And their perspectives to Settembrini. So three of the major perspectives in this text are represented by Settembrini and his sort of rationalism, Leo Nafta and his sort of, he's very rationalist, but Leo Nafta is considered more of a medieval mind, whereas Settembrini is considered more of a Renaissance humanist mind. And this leads to them having differing perceptions of the nature of human. A Renaissance perception of a human is that humans are born good. This is something that you get into in, say, like Rousseau, a little bit later during the Enlightenment, but that humans can craft themselves into a great ideal through great training and ideals. Whereas the sort of scholastic medieval idea that Nafta has sort of Christian underpinning, which is that humans are originally sinful, that humans are a problem that need to be dealt with. And this leads to major intellectual conflicts between these two individuals who were impacted. At one point, leave the Berghof hall. Nafta never lives in it. Settembrini does, but they will live on different levels of the same home. And Nafta will live in a very fine, well decorated home, and Settembrini will be in a bit of a dingy home. He always wears the same clothes, by the way, too. This is brought up over and over and over again. Sometimes like, oh, I have to put on another suit. He's always wearing the same pants. And well, that's sometimes the case with the The text ends with Hans Castorp returned to the flatlands. This is what the people in the Berghof refer to the people who are not in the sanatorium as the flatlanders, from his life in the horizontal position, storming the fields of Flanders. The individuals in the Berghof were often taking their rest cure, where they sit outside in the freezing weather and wrap themselves in blankets, lying down. It's like getting some sun, except for without any sun. And they call that taking the horizontal position, as it were. Themes to keep in mind, and then we'll go. Time and the subjective nature of it. Think about even this lecture, perhaps compare it to another lecture. Is it endless? Is it tedious? Does it take forever? Later in the day, when you spend an hour, run much smoother. Or are there other hours that take much longer? What is the deal with that? Time seems to be an objective measure, and yet there's a subjective experience of it that makes it elongate and shorten depending on what one is doing. Death is put in our face right in the first chapters. In fact, we see people we see dead corpses on sleds being slid down the mountain. This is something that causes quite some consternation to Hans. Mental and physical and moral lassitude. Then, of course, also Germany and its relationship to Britain and Russia. Well, that's all we have time for today. Glad to see you. Looking forward to seeing you one time next week, and then enjoy your Thanksgiving.